Junko Furuta died because 4 teenage boys decided her refusal meant she had no right to exist as a person anymore. That single rejection triggered 44 days of calculated dehumanization so systematic, so coldly routine, that it forces us to confront a terrifying question. How many people are capable of this if the right conditions align? Before we go further, I want you to comment below. What psychological factor do you think is most dangerous in group violence, peer pressure, diffusion of responsibility, or the normalization of cruelty? This is not a horror story. This is a psychological autopsy of moral collapse. Junko Furuta was 17 years old in November 1988. She lived in Misato, Saitama Prefecture, Japan. She was not rebellious. She was not reckless. She was the kind of teenager parents hold up as an example: polite, academically diligent, respectful. She worked part-time at a plastic molding factory after school to help her family. She had plans. She had been accepted to a high school with a strong academic reputation. She was preparing for entrance exams. She was careful about who she associated with. And that carefulness is what sealed her fate. Hiroshi Miyano was 18. He was a dropout. He was a bully. He fancied himself a Yakuza affiliate, though in reality he was a small-time thug who used intimidation and violence to maintain social dominance in his peer group. He had a history of sexual assault. He had a pattern of targeting girls, pressuring them, and punishing rejection. When he approached Junko, she did what any reasonable person would do. She said no. In a healthy psychological framework, rejection is processed as disappointment. In Miyano's mind, it was an attack on his status. Narcissistic injury does not fade quietly, it festers. It demands retaliation. And in a social environment where masculinity is tied to dominance and control, a public rejection becomes a wound that must be avenged. Would you have trusted someone like Miyano if you encountered him in your school? What warning signs would you have noticed? Miyano did not act alone. He recruited 3 others: Jay Ogura, Shinji Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe. These were not hardened criminals. They were teenagers. They had families. They attended school. They had normal social lives. But they also existed in a subculture where loyalty to the group outweighed individual morality, where proving toughness meant participating in cruelty, and where silence was survival. This is the first psychological fracture, the moment when fear of exclusion becomes stronger than empathy. On November 25, 1988, Junko was riding her bicycle home from her part-time job. It was evening. The streets were not deserted, but they were quiet enough. Miyano and an accomplice staged a simple trap. One of them pretended to assault her. The other pretended to rescue her. This is a classic manipulation tactic. Create a threat, then position yourself as the solution. It exploits the victim's fear and gratitude simultaneously. Junko, shaken and disoriented, accepted the offer of safety. She was led to a nearby park. Once isolated, the pretense dropped. She was threatened. She was told that her family would be harmed if she resisted. She was told that Miyano had Yakuza connections, that he could reach her parents, her siblings, anyone she cared about. This is psychological captivity. Physical restraints are not always necessary when the mind is imprisoned by fear. She was taken to Minato's house. His parents lived there. This is not a remote warehouse. This is not an abandoned building. This is a residential home in a populated neighborhood. And that fact is perhaps the most disturbing element of the entire case. Because it means that what happened next occurred with the knowledge, or at minimum the willful ignorance, of adults who could have intervened. Minato's parents knew Junko was there. They saw her. They heard her, and they did nothing. Psychologically, this is bystander moral disengagement. It operates on several cognitive distortions. Minimization. It is not as bad as it seems. Rationalization. It is not my responsibility. And fear. If I intervene, I will become a target. These distortions allow people to witness atrocity and remain passive. But there is another layer. Minato's parents were afraid of their own son. He had a history of violence. He had threatened them. They had already surrendered authority. In their minds, intervening would only make things worse. This is learned helplessness applied to parental responsibility. And so Junko remained. The first days were about establishing control. She was beaten. She was sexually assaulted. She was told repeatedly that resistance was futile, that escape was impossible, that her family would die if she tried. This is the foundation of long-term captivity, breaking the victim's will to resist by making survival seem contingent on compliance. But compliance did not bring safety. It never does in these situations because the goal was never conditional. The goal was total domination. Do you think Junko believed she could survive if she obeyed? Or do you think she knew from the beginning that this would not end well? The perpetrators fell into a routine. They attended school during the day. They socialized with friends. They maintained normal appearances. And then they returned to the house and continued the abuse. This compartmentalization is a hallmark of sustained cruelty. It allows the perpetrator to separate their actions from their identity. They are not monsters all the time. They are monsters only in specific contexts. And that separation makes it easier to continue. Psychologically, this is cognitive dissonance reduction. If they acknowledged the full weight of what they were doing, the guilt would be unbearable. So they reframe it. They tell themselves she deserves it. They tell themselves she is not really a person anymore. They tell themselves this is just how things are now. And the longer it continues, the more entrenched that belief becomes. Empathy is not a fixed trait. It is a cognitive process that can be suppressed, distorted, or entirely shut down under certain conditions. One of those conditions is repeated exposure to suffering without consequence. In the beginning, there may have been hesitation. There may have been discomfort. But each act of violence that went unpunished reinforced the idea that this was acceptable. Each day that passed without intervention normalized the situation further. This is desensitization. It is the same mechanism that allows soldiers to kill in war, that allows doctors to perform surgery without emotional collapse, that allows anyone to function in environments of extreme stress. But when applied to cruelty, it becomes a tool of moral destruction. The perpetrators began to compete. They escalated. They introduced new forms of abuse not out of necessity, but out of boredom. This is a critical shift. The initial violence may have been driven by anger or control. But over time, it became recreational. Junko was burned with cigarettes. She was forced to drink her own urine. She was beaten with metal rods. She was subjected to repeated sexual violence by multiple perpetrators and their associates. Her body began to shut down. Her face became unrecognizable. Her limbs swelled. Infections set in. And still, no one intervened. What would you have done if you were a friend of one of the perpetrators and found out what was happening? Would you have reported it, confronted them, or stayed silent out of fear? The most psychologically disturbing aspect is not the violence itself. It is the casualness with which it was inflicted. There was no rage. There was no passion. It was methodical. It was routine. It was boring. This is the banality of evil. It is not dramatic. It is not cinematic. It is mundane. And that makes it far more terrifying. None of the perpetrators acted alone. This was a collective crime. And that collective nature is what allowed it to continue. Diffusion of responsibility is a well-documented psychological phenomenon. When multiple people are involved in an action, each individual feels less personally accountable. The guilt is distributed, the blame is shared. And as a result, no one feels fully responsible. But there's another factor, social proof. When everyone around you is participating in something, it becomes normalized. If no one is objecting, it must be acceptable. This is why group violence is often more extreme than individual violence. The group provides validation. Miyano was the ringleader, but the others were not passive. They participated. They invited others to participate. At various points, dozens of people were aware of what was happening. Some participated directly. Others knew and said nothing. This is the second layer of moral collapse, the silent witnesses. In psychology, this is called the bystander effect. The more people who are aware of a situation, the less likely any individual is to intervene. Everyone assumes someone else will do something. And so no one does, but in this case it was not just passivity. It was active complicity. People who knew chose to protect the perpetrators. They chose to maintain the secret. They chose to prioritize loyalty over morality. Do you think the silent witnesses are as guilty as the perpetrators? Or is there a moral difference between doing harm and allowing harm? By late December, Junko's body was failing. She could no longer walk. She could no longer eat solid food. She was incontinent. She was delirious. She was dying. And the perpetrators knew it. On January 4th, 1989, they played a game of mahjong. Junko, barely conscious, was forced to participate. She lost. As punishment, they beat her with an iron barbell. They poured lighter fluid on her legs and set her on fire. She died either from shock or from the injuries sustained in that final assault. Her death was not a culmination of rage. It was the inevitable endpoint of sustained dehumanization. She had ceased to be a person in their eyes long before her body stopped functioning. They disposed of her body in a concrete-filled drum and abandoned it on a construction site. They returned to their lives. They went to school. They socialized. They acted as though nothing had happened. This is the final psychological fracture, the complete severance of action from consequence. The crime was discovered not through investigation but through coincidence. One of the perpetrators was arrested for an unrelated assault. During questioning, he confessed. The others were arrested shortly after. The trial revealed the full scope of the horror, but the sentences were shockingly lenient. Because the perpetrators were minors at the time of the crime, they were tried in juvenile court. The longest sentence was 20 years, most served far less. Their identities were legally protected, but over time they were leaked, and the public response was fury. This raises a critical question. Does the justice system adequately account for the psychology of group violence? Does it recognize the difference between impulsive crime and sustained, calculated cruelty? The perpetrators showed no remorse. In court, they minimized their actions. They blamed each other. They framed themselves as victims of circumstance. This is moral disengagement in its final form, the refusal to accept responsibility even when confronted with undeniable evidence. Do you believe people like this can be rehabilitated? Or is there a point where someone crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed? What allows a human being to torture another human being for 44 days? It is not a single factor. It is a convergence of psychological, social, and environmental conditions. First, there is the initial dehumanization. The victim must be reframed as less than human. This is achieved through language, through framing, through repeated assertions that they are different, lesser, deserving of punishment. Second, there is the normalization of violence. The first act is the hardest, but each subsequent act becomes easier. The brain adapts. The emotional response dulls. What was once unthinkable becomes routine. Third, there's the group dynamic. The presence of others provides validation, reduces individual guilt, and creates a feedback loop of escalation. Each person pushes the boundaries slightly further, and the group follows. Fourth, there is the absence of consequences. When violence goes unpunished, it is reinforced. The perpetrator learns that they can act with impunity, and that belief becomes self-fulfilling. Fifth, there is the role of bystanders. When others know and do nothing, it sends a message. This is acceptable. Silence is permission. And finally, there is the psychological compartmentalization. The perpetrator separates their actions from their identity. They are not a torturer. They are a student, a son, a friend who happens to do terrible things in specific contexts. This is how ordinary people commit extraordinary evil. Junko Furuta's case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. It is easy to label the perpetrators as monsters. It is comforting to believe that they are fundamentally different from us, but the psychological research suggests otherwise. Under the right conditions, with the right social pressures, with the right cognitive distortions, most people are capable of far more cruelty than they would like to believe. This is not an excuse, it is an explanation. And understanding the explanation is the only way to prevent it from happening again. The case also exposes the failure of social systems. Junko was held in a residential home. Adults knew. Neighbors may have suspected, and yet no one intervened. This is not just a failure of individuals. It is a failure of community, of responsibility, of the social contract that is supposed to protect the vulnerable. If you heard something disturbing happening in a neighbor's house, would you investigate? Would you call the police? Or would you convince yourself it was none of your business? Junko Furuta's name is remembered, her story is told, and that is important. Because the alternative is silence. And silence is what allowed this to happen in the first place. Her case has been studied in criminology, in psychology, and sociology. It has been cited in discussions of juvenile justice reform, of bystander intervention, of the psychology of group violence. But beyond the academic analysis, there is a simpler truth. Junko was a person. She had dreams, she had plans, she had people who loved her. And she was destroyed not by a natural disaster, not by an accident, but by deliberate, sustained human cruelty. Her death was preventable. At dozens of points, someone could have intervened. Someone could have called the police. Someone could have said no, and no one did. That is the legacy. Not just the horror of what happened, but the collective failure that allowed it to continue. Junko Furuta's case is not an anomaly. It is an extreme example of dynamics that exist in less severe forms all around us: bullying, abuse, cruelty, dehumanization, bystander passivity. The question is not whether we are capable of such things. The question is what we do to prevent them. Do we intervene when we see cruelty? Do we speak up when we witness injustice? Do we hold ourselves and others accountable? Or do we stay silent, convince ourselves it is not our problem, and hope that someone else will do something? Because that is the real horror, not that monsters exist, but that ordinary people, through inaction, allow them to thrive. What will you do the next time you witness something wrong? Will you be the person who intervenes or the person who looks away? Junko Furuta deserved better. She deserved a world where people cared enough to act, where silence was not mistaken for neutrality, where cruelty was met with resistance, not complicity. We cannot change what happened to her, but we can choose to be different. We can choose to be the person who says no, who calls for help, who refuses to be a silent witness. That is the only way her story has meaning. That is the only way we honor her memory, by refusing to let it happen again.